Thank you, General Nugi, for that inspirational address. It reminds all of us assembled here that climate change and security is an utmost priority for the UK at all levels and across all services. This urgency, highlighted by Prime Minister Johnson last week, Sir Keir Starmer this week, and General Nugi today, underlines the fact that we are no longer horizon scanning, wargaming, and workshopping to consider whether climate change is an existential threat to the defence and security of the UK, but rather to consider how we should respond to manifold and urgent climate change and security. Given this task, it's my great pleasure to welcome the speakers of our first panel. Their vital work has shaped this debate with direct contributions to climate science, economic policy, and human security. In turn, our speakers will be sharing their thoughts on what climate change is and how sure we are about their effects, how we should be adapting to mitigate these effects, and how we should respond in order to reduce and prevent additional and amplified effects. After all the speakers have made their opening remarks, we'll welcome questions from our virtual conference floor, and please put those in the Q&A section rather than the chat section. So first, we have Professor Joanna Hay, who is the former co-director of the Grantham Institute at Imperial College London University. Previously, she was the head of departments of physics. And in addition to her vast publishing history, Professor Hay was the lead author on various intergovernmental panels on climate change publications, and she also contributed to other international UK panels. Welcome, Professor Hay. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Louise, and also thank you to Tim for setting up the background in terms of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I'm going to talk a bit more about now, and also to Richard for that really inspirational introduction. I have to say, as a sort of boring old climate scientist who's been in academia for decades, the thought that I would be talking to people in the military at the end of my career is quite a surprise, but I find it very reassuring and marvellous that there's such activity going on. So much of what I've prepared now is coming from the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, which was published very recently. This is working Group 1 on the physics. And you've heard much of the content, or the content from Tim, but what's happening and what we can say about what's happening in the future. So this first picture is record of temperature, and you can see in the right end there's a little black line across the globe, and you can see this very steep increase in temperature over the last time. The temperatures, there aren't thermometers, but the temperatures can be reconstructed from various proxy records, which lake sediments or cores and this sort of thing. And sometimes you'll hear sort of climate change skeptics or deniers, whatever, saying, oh, well, it's been warmer in the past, so what are you making a big fuss about? And that's certainly true, it has been warmer in the past, but we're rapidly reaching the situation where that won't be the case. So if you look back in the current interglacial, this is the range of temperatures. And if you go back to the previous interglacial, between the ice ages, it was slightly warmer. But the point now is that it's not only getting as warm as those, but also, importantly, it's getting warm very, very fast. And we can look at that last 150-year period here. The black curve is the observed temperatures, as I've already shown you. But the coloured curves are simulated using climate models. And these are a major tool for climate science now. They're computer models that simulate the climate in the past and into the future. And there's two sets of analyses here. One in the brown colour is showing the simulated temperatures, global average temperatures, using both human and natural forcing factors. So this would include, for human factors, greenhouse gases, particulates that are put into the atmosphere from agriculture and industry, and also in terms of land use change. And we put all those things into the climate models, and we end up with those. If we just use the natural forcings, and of course there are natural forcings in climate change, particularly those due to the sun and due to volcanoes, which put particulates up into the atmosphere and make it cooler. The range of temperatures you couldn't distinguish before about 1970, but now you can see there's a clear distinction between simulations that include human factors and not, and we can't explain current warming without the man-made factors. So the IPCC also includes pictures across the globe. So we were talking about global average temperatures there, and Richard Nugent talked about extremes. And what we have here is the IPCC's assessment of observed, this is records, this is not predictions, of hot extremes in the past. And you can sort of see, this is a map, if you can see North America, South America, Africa, Asia and Australasia over here, divided up into chunks. And these are assessments of where heat extremes have been observed to take place over the globe. And pink means it's got warmer, or got more in heat extremes, and blue would mean fewer heat extremes, but there aren't any. Grey means it's difficult to tell. And the spots give a measure of confidence in the results. So we have lots of different models and different processes that we include. And if we're confident in the results, we can do it statistically, and we can assign 3 spots, so high confidence in the results. And you see that the heat exchanges in North America here, in Asia over here, in South Africa are all fairly substantial and robust. So that's what's observed changes. Now, if we look at future changes, of course, you have to forecast not only the climate, which is fairly difficult, but you've also got to forecast what's going to happen in human activity, which is more difficult. And so the IPCC uses what are called shared socio-economic pathways, different scenarios of what might happen into the future, taking account of different assumptions. And so the sort of high ones here are the ones with sort of unlimited growth and increase in GDP across the world. The blue one down here is where there's a real action taken on climate change, and you can see there's sort of slight peak in temperatures, and they decline down here to be less than 1.5 degrees by 2100. And so the assessments are done based on these different pathways. We also see distributions in temperature across the globe, simulated and forecast. So this is the observed temperature distributions, which are essentially at now, so 1 degree global warming relative to the end of the 19th century. And on the right here is the simulated changes for 1 degree global warming. And you can see that it's not bad, that computer models do quite a good job, particularly in suggesting that the changes are larger at high latitudes than low latitudes, and also larger over land than over the oceans. So if we look to the future, these are the simulations at 1.5 degrees global warming, 2 degrees and 4 degrees. You see it just gets worse. I mean, it's not surprising, but you see some of the temperature changes here. It's a 4 degree global, but some of the temperature changes here are more than 6-7 degrees warming. This is very serious and will really impact the way people live or are unable to live. You can do the same thing for precipitation. This is more difficult than temperature, but we can see here what's going to happen. Green means getting wetter, brown means getting drier. This is in terms of percentage changes. So of course, if you have somewhere that's very dry, like the Sahara, a small increase in precip comes up as a large percentage. But nevertheless, it seems to be a robust result that sub-Sahara here is going to get slightly wetter, whereas Central America, the Mediterranean, and the southern continents down here are going to get drier. And if we're talking about impacts on people and security, food security, water security, and indeed this migration, the impacts on the Mediterranean here in the Near East is, of course, very, very serious. Richard mentioned sea level rise. And what we've seen so far is 20 centimetres increase, this is globally, in sea level rise since the last century. sorry, 19th century. And these are the shared pathways, forecasts of what's going to happen in the future. And by the 2100s, you see they're getting up to perhaps 0.7 or something of a metre. Now, that in itself would be quite serious. And you can also see it's getting faster. The rate of change is not linear. It's getting faster with time. So I think, although Richard's correct, it's not going to have a huge effect in the near decades. Even with these economic pathways, it's going to be getting larger and something to be taken note of. But as he also alluded to, there are other scenarios which are not included in these. If you include other things, other processes which we know exist, but we don't have enough information to really properly quantify yet, you can see here, if the ice sheet, this is the ice on the land, which melts and then flows into the sea, if those are much less stable than we currently understand, the sea level rise goes up very, very fast to dramatic and terrifying levels. We've already mentioned changes in extremes. And when you talk about changes in extremes, of course, you can talk about things happening more often, which means an increase in their frequency, or you can think about them happening more with greater effect. So that's a change in intensity. And this has been done for a number of parameters: heat waves, heavy precipitation, soil moisture, drought, tropical storms. I just give two examples here to show you the sort of things that are going to happen. So here's an example for temperature extremes, and this is in terms of their frequency. A temperature that occurred once every decade during that end of the 19th century now occurs nearly 3 times per decade, so 3 times as often. And as we go to 1.5 degrees global warming, it's going to be more than 4 times per decade. So those are the extreme temperature events. And we've already heard about that extreme one in North America that's happened this year. It's going to be, instead of once in 1,000 years, perhaps a few times a decade. And here's an example of the intensity in heavy precipitation. A heavy precipitation event that now happens once every decade, which is happening once every decade, is 6.7% heavier now than during that pre-industrial period, and will be 10% heavier at 1.5 degrees global warming. So again, you see these things getting worse and worse. I know I'm running out of time. I just want to introduce the idea of an available carbon budget, because it's an important concept. Carbon dioxide in particular has a very long lifetime in the atmosphere, so it's accumulating. And also, the global temperature rise is proportional, just linearly proportional to the total accumulated CO2. So the more CO2 you put in, it stays there, the temperature rise goes up. That's very easy to demonstrate what's going to happen. And it leads to a very simple conclusion that if you want to constrain the global temperature to rise between any specified value, you might choose 1.5 degrees, which is the IPCC value, but you might be a little bit more relaxed and say you're happier with it going up by 3 degrees. But whatever temperature you fancy, you've got to stop the emissions. You've got to stop the emissions, because else the temperature will carry on going up. And the greater the current emissions, the sooner we need to stop. And this is just putting that into a different context. This is a graph of emissions of CO2 as in lots of different pathways, and showing what the only pathways that limit warming to less than 1.5 degrees by 2100. And you note 2 things here. They all reach net zero by the middle of the century, and most need negative emissions, or taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere towards the end of the century. And if you delay the peak now, you've got to have more capture later on. So finally, this is the emissions gap plot from the Climate Action Tracker website. And this is showing where we are in relation to where we need to be. So this only goes up to 2030 rather than the previous picture, which was going way out to 2100. The black is the historical emissions. The blue is the pledges and targets that were made for the Paris, and the new pledges and targets being made now so far for the London COP. And down here is what it needs to be on the right pathway for 1.5 degrees, and you can see we're a very long way from meeting that. So global action is required. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Hay, for that informative and comprehensive address. It really was very accessible as well. And I know that the delegates that we have today, that will be so useful for their units and departments across the UK military and HMG as well. So thank you very much for that address and for accepting our invitation. It was very kind of you. Thank you. Second, we have Professor John Barnett, who is the Australian Research Council Fellow in the School of Geography at Melbourne University. Professor Barnett is a prolific academic author with a publishing history that includes The Meaning of Environmental Security and being lead author on the chapter Human Security in the 5th Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in, I believe, 2016. Welcome, Professor Barnett. Please take the floor.
Thanks very much, Louise. Thanks for inviting me to talk. You're very brave. You've taken a gamble. I'm in the 35th week of lockdown. I'm Australian. It's 8 p.m. and I'm sober. So let's see how this goes. I'd like to talk a little bit, and what I was going to say follows, I think, or complements quite nicely General Nuji's talk about climate change, about the idea of adaptation and how that works with the notion of security. So we know that climate change is a risk to security in different ways. It's a risk to what we might call human security, to the predictability and continuity and the things that people value. There's a lot of evidence where I do a lot of my work in the Pacific Islands that there's a relationship between climate change and domestic violence. Climate change is a risk to health and people's well-being, and climate change is a risk to people's livelihoods. And so at that level and that scale, it's very clear, I think, that climate change is a security risk. General Nuji gave a good talk about the risk that climate change poses to armed conflict, and the literature has a lot to say about this, and that debate really is about how strong is the signal between climate change and armed conflict. Irrespective of the issue of armed conflict, we know that, or we strongly suspect, that climate change poses a risk to various elements of national security. The critical infrastructure, the question about military bases was an interesting one, and one I know that concerns the United States military and the Australian military as well. Questions to territorial integrity, exclusive economic zones, whole islands that are the bases of the capital of some countries where I work in Tuvalu or Kiribati or the Marshall Islands. If you lose your capital, that's a security risk without a shot being fired. And it may increase geopolitical rivalry, and General Nuji outlined this very well. Issues about the Arctic, issues about conflict over pelagic fisheries, transboundary rivers, exclusive economic zones. And those risks are, of course, all interrelated. Now, we know that climate change isn't just going to be about armed conflict, but it is useful, I think, to think about that relationship a little bit. What the literature on climate change and armed conflict shows you is correlation, but not so much about causality. We don't have many theories, but theories are important, because if we want to intervene at opportune times to prevent climate change causing conflict, we have to have some way of thinking about the way climate change may lead to conflict. Here's a theory of sorts. If you think about the dynamic of recruitment, and General Nuji made some interesting observations about pirates in Somalia, for example. Why do people join militias? Why do people join militaries? Why do people join armed conflict? And it's often because the opportunity cost of doing so are very low. They have very few other things, to sustain themselves. And when we think about the impact that climate change may have on people's livelihoods, particularly those people whose livelihoods are very heavily dependent on climate sensitive things like rainfed agriculture or fishes, and when their livelihoods fail under those conditions of stress, have few social protections, so they're not being supported by income support or work for money or work for food, they then become somewhat more desperate and maybe more likely to join militias. And so we know that this is a huge security problem, but it also increases the supply of labour potentially by lowering the opportunity cost of violence and participating in violence. Climate change can also cause rising food prices, which puts pressures on livelihoods. It can increase a propensity for migration from rural areas to rural towns or to urban areas. That then in turn increases tension over accesses to infrastructure, services, public goods, property, natural resources in those destination areas to which migrants arrive. We know that poorly managed rural to urban migration is associated with the formation of gangs and militia, and all this can increase grievances. And so there's this pathway between dispersed livelihood shocks that at one level appear to be simply human security problems, but may cascade into more significant risks to conflict. At the same time, we need to think about the institutions that dampen conflict or that work to prevent conflict, which in most cases is the state. Of course, sometimes the state is the principal agent of conflict. But in most states, that isn't the case. And they do that by being able to provide the rule of law, by monopolising the use of force and being able to do that across their territorial extent. To the extent that climate change may undermine the capacity of the state, we need to consider that. Increases can slow economic growth, that's quite clear. Sam's work has shown that. Can slow efforts at poverty reduction, can increase demands on public spending arising from disasters. The costs of climate change adaptation can decrease revenue to the state when that revenue is tied to climate sensitive sectors like agriculture or fisheries, can undermine its capacity to provide social opportunities like education and healthcare. Can decrease in turn its capacity to administer the rule of law and conflict prevention, especially in remote regions where the cost of doing that is quite difficult. This provides feedback mechanisms into the human security dimensions, all of which can weaken the conflict dampening capacity of the state, as well as create grievances against the state. We also strongly suspect, and there's some emerging evidence, that poorly implemented climate change projects can themselves increase the risk of local conflict. There's some evidence that reducing emissions from deforestation, payment for ecosystem services, and carbon sequestration activities are increasing tension in local areas. It's possible that significant adaptation projects that are big exposure mitigating things, think big engineering works, or lots of people talk about migration as an adaptation, can actually cause conflict. If you think about the Green Climate Fund, for example, which is the biggest climate fund or will be in time, the proposal there is that the Green Climate Fund would spend $100 billion per annum, 50% on roughly mitigation, 50% on roughly adaptation. So that's $100 billion that can do an awful lot of good to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote adaptation. But if it's $100 billion that isn't, or some proportion of that, isn't very well screened for its conflict risk potential, that may change, that can become a source of greed. People may seek to capture those projects or the right to those projects, or people may be aggrieved over the distribution of benefits of those projects. All of these projects have implications for property rights and the distribution of access to income and services between and within communities. The risk of these things causing conflict is not negligible, and we need to be aware that not all climate change action is good action, and General Nuji explained that in another way as well. Joanna showed a more recent version of this graph. I quite like this old one. We're talking now about adaptation. And the thing about this graph that is important is to realize that timescale down the bottom there is from 10,000 years through to the present, and it's showing the level of human influence on the climate over that period of time. So humans settled into farming about 10,000 years ago, and we formed our first cities about 5,000 years ago. The whole of the history of our civilization formed in a relatively stable climate envelope. The crops that we grow and where we grow them, the water systems that we rely on, the cities and where they are built were all built in a climate that is now no longer a climate that our future is inheriting. So the whole basis, or the whole climatic basis of human civilization, is going to change. And that really puts into perspective the adaptation challenge that we are now facing. We are going to have to adapt, and in some ways very significantly. And before I dive into adaptation, let me just say two things. I appreciate I'm going to use up a bit of time here. Just to step sideways. First, and Joanna made this point, that reducing the rate of emissions is absolutely critical for climate security. And Joanna showed this with the curves are really great. The speed of the curve matters. And so the more we reduce emissions, the slower the rate of change that our institutions have to deal with, the more likely our institutions are to be successful. Critical social problems emerge when the rate of change is rapid. when there's significant economic shocks, for example, that throw millions of people into livelihood crises, or when there are significant precipitation shocks that radically change food security systems. When change is slow and progressive, we can learn and adapt. When change is rapid, we don't. And so slowing the rate of change is really critical, and we do that by reducing emissions. The second thing to say is that peace is really important for sustainability. Peace reduces emissions. And if you look at this very nice graph from my colleague Multi Meinhausen and colleagues showing the shared socioeconomic pathways, which are outlining different pathways to mitigation. The one where we get the lowest emissions is the one where there's high global cooperation and technology transfer and investments into sustainability. The ones where we get really high rapid emissions are ones where there is conflict, regional rivalry, trade blocks. And so if we are to achieve the kinds of emissions reduction scenarios that we are going to be required for climate security, we need peace as a precondition for doing that. So there's very interesting interdependencies here between conflict and climate change, and lots of feedbacks, positive and negative, between them. Secondly, we know that the sorts of human security challenges that I'm arguing will cascade into conflict challenges are massively exacerbated by violence. Violence destroys capabilities, and violence destroys capital and assets that enable people to adapt. The literature on food security and famines is very clear that these things occur in places typically where there have been significant violent events, because it disrupts markets and infrastructure and human capital formation. So if we want to avoid huge humanitarian crises and pockets of vulnerability, which may then cascade into reproducing conflicts, we really need to be focusing a lot on peace building. Peace is central to our ability to tackle climate change. So having said all that and tried to sort of outline some kind of theory about the way this works, let me say a few things then about what I think that implies, broadly speaking, for adaptation to climate change. And here's 7 things, so we could debate what these are. I think we really need to critically focus on those sectors where people's livelihoods are heavily sensitive and dependent on climate change. And that is in a sense a commitment to continuing to doing sustainable rural development. And in some ways, climate change reduces the effort to those older development agendas, but they're still really important. We need to diversify livelihoods by doing all the things that we know that help reduce people's sensitivity to climate change and to climate events. Investments in infrastructure, social and financial services, education for females, all those things make a difference. Comprehensive social protection. So making sure that in times of crises, people receive support from the state to support their livelihood, so that they are not forced into more desperate and radical lifestyle or livelihood-based decisions, joining militias or joining gangs, risky forms of migration. Those kinds of activities are enabled when states are able to provide social protection. And social protection, I think, is really key to adaptation and to peace building. Improving urban planning in capital cities, but also in rural towns to which migrants go to. And we know what towns they are, because they're the towns that people already move to. Migration is very path dependent and patterned. Because in the event that there will be more rural to urban migration, we need to make sure that that migrants are not either discriminated against or seen to be competing for limited opportunities and services and resources and infrastructure and those kinds of things. So surge planning, or capacity to surge infrastructure in urban areas, is really important. This is all entirely feasible. Shanghai municipality had planned for something like a 3 million population growth in a 10-year period, got a 7 million population growth for that period of time. Every single one of those people is in school and in housing. So you can do this, you just need to know that you have to do it. Innovations in disaster insurance are really, really important. And this is not just the sort of standard stuff that we take for granted, but micro-scale insurance for rural producers and for fishers, index-based insurance for whole economies. There's a lot of innovation in this space, and it's very important. And it works like social protection to provide some security and stability for people and societies through times of shock and crises. Strengthening justice systems and the rule of law is very important. If climate change is going to create scarcity, conflict, and greeds and grievances around resources, then ways of resolving those disputes peacefully are really important. And I just meant formal rule of law. There's de jure and de facto forms of rule of law here, but they're all very, very important. If there's going to be more conflict, then we need to invest in the institutions that stop conflicts becoming violent. one of my great bugbears in this world, and we've been talking about climate change for 30 years in the region where I work in the South Pacific, it's all about change. We anticipate all this negative change. We monitor for none of it. We don't monitor food prices. We don't monitor migration. We don't monitor anything. So monitoring for the kinds of social changes that we think are going to cascade into security problems is very, very important, so we can see it coming and we can respond in a timely way. And having, therefore, in place contingency plans and response plans in the event that those problems emerge is also very important. And finally, because we think, and there's going to be billions and billions of dollars of investment in mitigation and adaptation, there needs to be mechanisms for screening the conflict risk potential of climate change projects to make sure that they themselves don't increase the risk of conflict. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you, Professor Barnett. That was an incredibly insightful contribution, and to be able to so eloquently move between sea level rises to important things like surge planning was fantastic. And I'd just like to reiterate, because I think it is such an important point, that our duty to protect vulnerable members as well, in terms of your reference to migrants, for example. I thought that was really really insightful as well, because obviously we have a duty to protect those who are made vulnerable by this climate change situation. And so I'm sure that your contribution will be shaping a number of work strands that we're currently working on in the UK. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation despite 35th week of lockdown and your evening. So thank you very, very much for joining us. Thank you. Lastly, we have Professor Sam Fankhauser, who is Professor of Climate Change, Economics and Policy at the University of Oxford. And as well as being the Research Director of Oxford Net Zero, Professor Fankhauser is the co-investigator of the Place-Based Climate Action Network. And Professor Fankhauser's extensive publications list include the impact of strategic climate legislation, evidence from expert interviews in the UK Climate Change Act. And so thank you, Professor Fankhauser. Please take the floor.
On the right-hand side, you see the reduction in emissions that Joe has been talking about. So over the next 30 years or so, they have to come down to something approaching net zero. And that means reversing sort of 200 years worth of emissions growth. You only see the last 30 years on this chart here. So it really is a steep reduction in emissions. On the left-hand side, you see the context in which that emissions reduction will have to happen. And it's a story, obviously, of economic development. So the world doesn't stand still. Over the next 15 years, if you look at infrastructure, there are estimates that the amount of infrastructure spending, particularly in Asia and in emerging markets, will be such that we are doubling the amount of infrastructure that we have on the planet. So all the roads, the ports, the water systems, the power grids that we currently have, we will build the same amount of stuff again over the next 15 years or so. GDP will probably double over 20 years if you sort of assume typical growth rates. That means that everything we produce and consume today, so all the cement, the cars, the haircuts, the holidays, everything we produce and consume today, we will produce and consume the same amount of stuff again within 20 years. Finally, urban population. There's an expectation that the urban population will double in something like 40 years. Obviously, these people will have to live somewhere, and that means we will double the sort of urban space that we have. And I think John talked about that already. So all the cities, all the Shanghais, the New Yorks, the Londons, the Mexico cities that we currently have, we will have to build the equivalent of that living space again. So that is both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge obviously is that we are going to invest a lot. And if we do it wrong, we are going to lock in a very high carbon and a very climate vulnerable future. But if we get it right, we can lock in a low carbon, climate resilient future. So let's look at, let's disaggregate that emission reduction challenge a little bit. And it is a race. People call it, because it's a 30-year race to net zero emissions. And subsectors are better prepared than others. And in that race, electric power, electricity generation is ahead of all the other sectors. I think we have reached tipping points on electricity generation. Renewable energy sources are now so cheap that they will or already are the cheapest way of producing electricity. So that sector, we have to, stay the course, invest a lot more, but the sort of the change has probably been baked in by now. Surface transport, we are close to that tipping point as well. Electric cars are becoming more prevalent. They're becoming cheaper. Batteries are getting better. So we're not quite there at the tipping point yet, but we're very close to reaching a tipping point, maybe in the next 10 years or so. And then obviously, again, we have to stay the course and turn over the fleet that we have. What follows after that in the race is a much slower story. Buildings is now the second or first emission source in the UK. We do have the technological solutions. We know how to do zero carbon buildings. So it's a challenge of rolling out those technologies, the heat pumps, maybe the hydrogen. It's a challenge of making them societally acceptable as well. People don't particularly like heat pumps. They like their boilers. So there's a behavioral challenge that goes with the technological challenge. Industry is probably on the same level as buildings, I would say. A lot of industry, or a lot of our manufacturing sector actually is mostly consuming electricity, but there are some electro-intensive sectors or energy-intensive sectors, steel, cement, chemicals, where the technological solutions are starting to emerge, but they're not quite there yet. They're still expensive. They haven't been proven at scale. So in the meantime, we will try to do both in buildings and industry. We will have to try to increase resource efficiency and just use less energy for a given amount of output. The laggard you see there, land use change in agriculture and aviation, where technologies really are still slow, and we will have to rely quite heavily on behavioral change. We will have to rely on changing eating habits, for example, and perhaps change our sort of flying addiction that many of us have or have had before COVID. So that's the race to net zero. Some sectors where we are well ahead and need to stay the course, and some sectors where a lot of effort is still needed. Is that effort forthcoming? To some extent it is. This chart here shows you the number of climate change laws that we have on the globe. It's about 2,000 climate change laws, or laws that are roughly broadly relevant to climate change, that deal with energy efficiency, with renewable, with transport, with deforestation, and so on. And the chart shows you, the color coding shows you the number of laws in individual countries. You see some countries there with over 20 relevant laws. I point out Brazil there and Indonesia, and I point those out because they're big enough that you can see them on the map. But I also point those out because it shows that having a law on the books isn't the whole story. It's necessary, but not sufficient, because a lot of those Indonesian and Brazilian laws are about deforestation. And obviously we know deforestation hasn't been stopped because those laws weren't implemented or they weren't strong enough. But still, the legislative basis is increasingly there. On the left-hand side, you see some of the sort of better laws, the flagship laws, the strategic laws that really try to make a difference. The UK Climate Change Act is one of those examples, and the Climate Change Act has actually been sort of emulated in other countries, Sweden, New Zealand, they're further down the list. Let me just point out China as well, because China is interesting because it isn't put, their climate ambition isn't put in laws, it's put in 5-year plans, but the ambition substantively is very similar actually to what we find in some of those climate change laws. So countries are doing things, but they find it difficult. And so let me sort of focus now on the difficulty, although as I said in the beginning, this really is a story of this can be done, there's an opportunity here, but let me focus on some of the difficulties. One is the impact on people, or the perceived impact on people. And people, all of us sort of come in two categories, or we all have two things that we do: we consume and we work. And consumers are worried about the price of energy and energy-related things, fuel in particular. And the picture here is the impact of the French energy law, which put in place a carbon tax, which brought the Gilets jaunes protest out into the street. That's an example of how, if you do those policies that we really need, not carefully enough, you get the backlash from consumers. Same risk is there for workers. There's no evidence at all that the number of jobs or the quality of jobs will be different in the green economy than it is in today's economy. But a lot of those jobs will be different. They will require different skills. Usually they require more cognitive skills and less mechanical repeat skills. And so there's a job there to be done to reskill the workforce and equip them to the new jobs that will become available, and make that transition to those new jobs easier. If that is not done properly, and the world isn't full of good examples of industrial transitions, if that job isn't done properly, that's a source of tension. That's potentially a source of uprising and violence as well. So that's the impact of people, where we can see downside risks. There's an impact on assets, on capital stocks, where we can see downside risks. One of those is our natural resources. If you think back to Joe's carbon budget, the amount of carbon that we are still allowed to put in the atmosphere, and you compare that carbon budget with the amount of carbon that is on the balance sheet of fossil fuel companies, or of state-owned companies as well, you see that about two-thirds of those reserves will have to be written off. They can't be burned. And obviously that's sort of a source of economic tension. If you have an asset that you think is valuable and it turns out you can't use it. So there are complications there in the weighting. Or you can look at built capital, you can look at the power stations in the world, and you calculate how much carbon will those power stations emit if you run them in the way you expect to run them over 40 years at full load or whatever. And you see that the fair share of those committed emissions go beyond the carbon budget that we have left. So the existing capital stock that we have cannot be run in the way that we thought we would run it when we built it. And even new things that we build, definitely we cannot run in the way we usually think we can run these things when we invest in them. So there's a tension here, potential of what will happen to capital, to financial returns by implications, but also the geopolitics of it. So in the last couple of minutes, let me say something about the geopolitics, not quite the geopolitics, but the changing supply chains is the better word. If we move from conventional cars, conventional energy sources, to clean energy sources, it changes those supply chains. It changes our reliance, as General Nagy as well said, reliance on certain materials. This chart here from the International Energy Agency just visually shows you what that might mean. Conventional cars versus electric cars, there in the top row. There's a much more diverse set of minerals and raw materials that will have to go into the technology. The same is true for power generation. Natural gas and coal there at the bottom is a relatively straightforward technology when it comes to the diversity of the minerals. Some of the new things we're talking about, solar PV, for example, and wind, much more diverse set of minerals that we need, and they're in different places. This chart here shows you the top 3 producers of some of those minerals that will be needed in terms of the extraction of those minerals and in terms of the processing of those minerals. And you see the sort of the geopolitical world we're used to on fossil fuels on the top left, or top 2 rows there, where we have Russia, the Middle East, the US as the sources where these things come from. That's replaced by a much more diverse picture, certainly when it comes to the extraction. New sort of countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, China, Indonesia, Chile, which all of a sudden have importance in terms of supply chain risks. And if you think that's a sort of an abstract thought, some of you might have seen in the paper the story about solar PV. Solar PV needs a lot of silicon, polysilicon. Most of that comes out of China. Specifically, it comes out of one province in China populated by the Uyghur minority Muslim population. And it turns out a fair amount of our solar PV supply chain is based potentially on slave labor conditions in that particular province. So here's already an example of how these complicated supply chains might throw up new risks that we haven't been used to in the past. But let me stop here.